Go ahead and try this number 30 before you watch the video. In a previous reading deep dive question, which involved exotericity of languages and all these complex terminologies, what we talked about there was the more superficially complicated a question seems, the more straightforward the underlying logic is. Because the question's going to be probably way too hard, or maybe it would just be like the hardest of the hard question if both the language were complicated, the terminology were complicated, and the logic were complicated. So in this case, it's one of those first situations where this language is very complicated. There's a lot of terms here that I don't even know. I've never heard of a siderophile until I read this question. Right? No matter how much I know, I can't know enough because I will encounter things I don't know. But the fact that I don't know what a siderophile is, or I frankly don't know anything what they're talking about here, does not affect my ability to actually answer this. Because the idea is, what are the logical relationships between these ideas? And then when we pick our transition word here, what amplifies or supports or explicates that logical relationship? So let's look at the text. If the formation of Earth's mantle had been purely a product of core differentiation, whereby heavier elements sink toward the core and lighter elements rise, the upper mantle would be depleted of heavy siderophile elements. So they're saying, here's our Earth, and if the process had been purely a core differentiation process, the lighter elements would have risen, the heavier elements would have sank, and so we would have had very few heavy elements on the surface, right? Because they would have sunk and the lighter stuff would have gone up. So that's what we would expect if this model were true. You can probably expect, as is often the case here, where we're going here is that it's not true. It's complicated in some way. So siderophiles are much more abundant in the mantle than predicted in that model, however. Right, there's our contrast. So actually we have some heavy stuff here. Why? Well, here we go. Blank extraterrestrial material containing siderophiles, likely from asteroid or comet impacts, almost certainly accreted to Earth following core differentiation. So what they're saying is one explanation for this, why this is happening, is not so much that core differentiation is wrong. That's an option we could have taken, right? We could have said, oh, the model's messed up. Core differentiation doesn't happen in the way that we thought. So maybe that's why there's more heavier on the surface. They do not take that option here. They say there must have been extraterrestrial, not aliens like UFOs, but asteroids and comets from outside of Earth, extraterrestrial, that impacted the surface and brought with them the heavier elements. So what's the relationship then between this claim and the previous? So we've established in the first sentence this model. We complicate the model with an observation in the second. And then we try to give an explanation for why the model is not fully accounting for the situation, this additional factor. So when we think of our families, I'm thinking of a kind of cause and effect here, right? Given that we have this model and given that there's this observation that does not agree with the model, therefore, it must be the case, or it's likely the case, or almost certainly the case, that this is what happened. And so when I'm looking for a cause and effect, the word that jumps out here is hence. Hence, therefore, thus, anything like that could have worked. Consequently, accordingly, any word of cause and effect would work out here. So we get B. Looking at the others, that said you would use often more of a contrast situation, or when you've laid out a claim, but then you're going to shift away from it and kind of either talk about a contrasting point or a different point in some way. So that said is not used in this situation. We're building more of a direct cause and effect relationship. This is also not an example of the previous statement. It's a consequence of it. And similarly with likewise, it's not similar to the previous statement. It is a consequence of it. So the only one with the right family here is hence, which is therefore, or thus, cause and effect, conclusion. And so therefore 30 is B.